The sun was setting over the quiet suburban neighborhood, casting long shadows that danced across the pavement. Terence, a bright-eyed teenager with an infectious smile, had just parked his prized possession, a sleek black sedan his mom had helped him buy after months of saving. It wasn't new, but to Terence, it was everything. The car symbolized freedom, hard work, and countless hours spent washing dishes at the local diner. Terence had always been the kind of kid who went the extra mile. Whether it was helping his mom carry groceries or tutoring his younger sister in math, he believed in doing right by people. His car was parked in front of a small convenience store as he ran in to grab a soda and snacks for the late-night study session ahead. The bikers showed up without warning. 4 of them, clad in leather jackets with patches that screamed intimidation, rolled into the parking lot on roaring motorcycles. Their leader, a burly man with a beard that looked like it could double as a bear's, was the first to notice Terence's car. His cold eyes narrowed, and a smirk spread across his face. "Nice ride," he muttered to his crew as he dismounted. The others chuckled, already circling the car like vultures around prey. Inside the store, Terence had no idea what was happening. He was chatting with the cashier, an older gentleman named Mr. Carter, who always gave him a discount on snacks. Terence had a way of brightening people's days, even in the simplest interactions. Meanwhile, the bikers were working quickly. They weren't new to this. With a few tools and some practiced movements, they had the car hot-wired and rolling before anyone noticed. One of them let out a whoop of excitement as the engine purred under his touch. Terence stepped out of the store just in time to see the tail lights of his car disappearing down the road. For a moment, he froze, disbelief hitting him like a tidal wave. His heart raced as his mind struggled to process what had just happened. Then, without thinking, he sprinted after the car, yelling, "Hey, that's mine! Stop!" But the bikers didn't stop. They were already several blocks away, laughing and high-fiving as they sped toward their hideout. Terence stood in the middle of the road, panting, his fists clenched. His car, his dream, was gone. But if the bikers thought they'd gotten away clean, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. Because what they didn't know was that Terence wasn't alone. Minutes later, the bikers pulled into an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that screamed trouble. The leader, still smirking, stepped out of the car and admired it under the flickering light of a nearby street lamp. "Not bad," he said, patting the hood. But then something shifted. The air seemed to grow colder, heavier. One of the bikers, a lanky man with a nervous tic, glanced around uneasily. "You feel that?" he whispered. "Feel what?" The leader snapped, his patience already wearing thin. "I don't know. It's like we're being watched." The others laughed, but it was a hollow sound. The eerie silence of the warehouse seemed to press in on them, amplifying every creak and groan of the old building. And then they heard it, a distant sound, faint at first, but growing louder. It was a low rhythmic thud, like the pounding of a drum. The bikers froze, their eyes darting toward the source of the noise. "What the?" the leader muttered, his bravado faltering. Suddenly the sound stopped. The silence was deafening. And in that silence, a voice rang out, clear and steady. "You stole from the wrong person." The bikers whipped around, their eyes wide with fear. Standing in the shadows was a figure they couldn't quite make out, but the presence was unmistakable. It wasn't just Terence. It was someone or something that exuded a quiet, unshakable power. "Who are you?" the leader demanded, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. The figure stepped forward, just enough for the dim light to catch the edge of a determined expression. Terence's voice was calm, but his words carried the weight of an unstoppable force. "You'll find out soon enough," he said, taking another step closer. And that was when the bikers realized that their night was far from over, and their nightmare had just begun. The bikers stood frozen, their laughter long gone. The warehouse, once their safe haven, now felt like a trap. Terence, though young and unassuming, carried himself in a way that unsettled them. He wasn't yelling or pleading. He simply stood there, his calm presence more unnerving than any outburst. The leader, known as Big Hank, forced himself to break the silence. "Kid, you've got guts showing up here alone, but you're out of your league. Walk away before you get hurt." His voice was gruff, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Terence didn't move. Instead, his gaze swept over the group, taking in every detail: the oil-stained boots, the frayed patches on their jackets, the faint smell of gasoline mixed with sweat. These weren't just petty thieves. They were seasoned criminals who thought they had the upper hand. "I'm not here to fight," Terence said evenly, his voice carrying through the cavernous space. I just want what's mine. Big Hank chuckled, a hollow sound that didn't reach his eyes. What's yours? You mean this car? He slapped the hood with a smirk. Newsflash, kid. Possession's 9/10 of the law. This baby's ours now. The other bikers laughed nervously, trying to feed off their leader's bravado, but the tension in the room was palpable. One of them, a wiry man named Pete, shifted uncomfortably and muttered maybe we should just let him have it, Hank. It's not worth. Shut up, Pete. Hank barked, cutting him off. He turned back to Terence, his patience wearing thin. I'm giving you one last chance. Walk away or I'll make you regret ever stepping foot in here. Terence didn't flinch. Instead, he took another step forward, his sneakers echoing against the concrete floor. You don't understand, he said, his tone steady but firm. That car isn't just a thing to me. It's not just metal and wheels. It's everything I've worked for, everything my family sacrificed for. You took more than just a car, you stole a piece of my life. Hank's smirk faltered, but he quickly masked it with a sneer. Save the sob story, kid. Life's tough. Get used to it. Before Terence could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind him. The bikers stiffened, their eyes darting to the shadows near the entrance. Another figure emerged, this one older, with a weathered face and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Who's this? Hank demanded, his voice tinged with suspicion. The newcomer stepped into the light, revealing a lean build and a calm demeanor that mirrored Terence's. Name's Marcus, he said, his voice smooth but firm. I'm here to make sure no one does something they'll regret. Terence glanced at Marcus, a flicker of recognition passing between them. Marcus wasn't just anyone. He was a family friend, a former Marine who had seen more than his fair share of trouble. When Terence called for help, Marcus didn't hesitate. He knew the stakes were higher than just a stolen car. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. They could tell Marcus wasn't someone to mess with, but Hank wasn't ready to back down. His pride and his reputation were on the line. This your backup? Hank scoffed. What's he gonna do? Lecture us to death? Marcus tilted his head slightly, a faint smile playing at the corner of his lips. You're not as clever as you think, Hank. You've made a mistake tonight, and deep down you know it. Hank's jaw tightened, but before he could retort, Marcus continued. You think you're untouchable because you've gotten away with this kind of thing before. But here's the thing about people like you. You always underestimate the ones you think are weaker. And that's where you lose. Pete, still fidgeting, finally spoke up. Hank, maybe we should just give the car back. It's not worth all this trouble. Hank glared at him. You scared of a kid and some guy with a big mouth? Grow a spine, Pete. But the tension was shifting. The bikers, who had once seemed so confident, were starting to feel the weight of their decisions. The room felt smaller, the shadows darker. Even Hank, for all his bluster, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Terence, sensing the crack in their resolve, took another step forward. This is your chance to do the right thing, he said, his voice calm but firm. You can give me back my car, and we can all walk away from this without things getting worse. Hank laughed, but it was a strained, hollow sound. Worse? What are you gonna do, kid? Call the cops? By the time they get here, we'll be long gone. Terence didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With a few taps, he brought up a screen and held it up for the bikers to see. What's that? Hank demanded, his tone sharper now. Live feed, Terence said simply. From the dashcam I installed last week. It's been recording everything since you took the car. Your faces, your voices, even the license plates on your bikes. It's all here. The bikers froze, their eyes widening as they processed the implications. Pete muttered a curse under his breath, while another member, a burly man named Roy, took a step back, his face pale. You're bluffing, Hank said, but the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. Terence shrugged. Maybe I am, but are you willing to bet everything on that? The silence that followed was deafening. The bikers, once so sure of themselves, now stood on the edge of panic. Hank's bravado was crumbling, and the others were looking to him for direction, their confidence in his leadership fading fast. Marcus stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. You've got a decision to make, Hank. Do the right thing now or watch everything fall apart later. Your call. The bikers exchanged nervous glances, the weight of their situation finally sinking in. Hank's fists clenched at his sides, his mind racing as he tried to figure a way out, but deep down he knew they were cornered. The air in the warehouse was thick with tension, each second stretching into eternity as the bikers weighed their options. Hank's gaze darted between Terence, Marcus, and the phone still held aloft, its screen glowing ominously in the dim light. He could feel the stares of his crew boring into him, each one silently demanding a solution he didn't have. Pete, shifting uneasily from foot to foot, finally broke the silence. "Hank, we can't mess around with this. If that camera's really got us, we're done. It's not just about the car, it's everything we've been doing." Hank shot him a glare that could have cut steel. "Shut it, Pete. You don't speak for me." But Pete wasn't backing down this time. "Maybe not," he said, his voice trembling slightly but gaining strength. "But I'm not going down for this. We've gotten away with a lot, but this kid's different. Look at him. He's not scared of us. And that guy," he pointed at Marcus, who stood silently, his arms crossed. "He's not bluffing. I'm telling you, Hank, we're out of our depth." Terence watched the exchange quietly, his expression unreadable. He wasn't sure what was more surprising, that Pete was standing up to Hank, or that the group's fear was starting to outweigh their arrogance. It was the first crack in their unity, and Terence knew it was his best chance to push forward. "You can still fix this," Terence said, his tone calm but laced with urgency. "Give me back my car and I'll delete the footage. You won't have to worry about me or anyone else coming after you. But if you don't..." He let the words hang, the unspoken consequences filling the silence. Roy, the burliest of the group, stepped forward, his heavy boots echoing on the concrete floor. "And what if we don't believe you?" He growled, his voice low and menacing. "What if we take that phone and make sure there's nothing left to share?" Marcus finally spoke, his voice a quiet warning. "You're welcome to try, but I promise it won't end the way you think." Roy hesitated, his bravado faltering as he took in Marcus's unflinching gaze. There was something about the way Marcus carried himself, calm, confident, unshakable, that made him seem far more dangerous than any of them. Hank, sensing his control slipping, slammed his palm onto the hood of the car. "Enough!" he barked, his voice echoing through the warehouse. "We're not scared of some punk kid and his phone, and we're sure as hell not scared of you," he said, pointing at Marcus. "This is our turf, and we're the ones calling the shots." But even as he spoke, Hank could feel the cracks spreading. His crew was looking at him differently now, their loyalty wavering under the weight of doubt. He needed to do something, and fast, before everything unraveled. Terence, sensing the shift, pressed on. "You think you're calling the shots, but you're not. Every second you waste here is a second closer to everything falling apart. You can feel it, can't you? That this time, things are different." Hank's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. He wanted to argue, to push back, but deep down he knew Terence was right. The kid wasn't backing down, and neither was the man standing beside him. They were out of options, and the walls were closing in. But just as the tension reached its breaking point, a new sound cut through the air, a distant rumble, growing louder with each passing second. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado fading as the noise grew closer. "What now?" Pete muttered, his voice barely audible. The rumble turned into the unmistakable roar of engines, and moments later, headlights pierced the darkness outside the warehouse. The bikers tensed, their hands inching toward concealed weapons as the sound of tires screeching to a halt filled the air. Marcus' expression didn't change, but his eyes flicked toward the entrance, his posture shifting subtly. Terence, though outwardly calm, felt his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea who or what was coming, but he knew it wasn't part of the plan. The biker's unease turned to outright panic as the sound of doors slamming echoed through the night, followed by the heavy tread of boots on gravel. Hank, his confidence crumbling, barked orders to his crew. "Stay sharp. Don't let them get the drop on us." The warehouse door creaked open, and a group of figures stepped into the light. They weren't police, but their presence was just as commanding. Dressed in dark clothing with an air of quiet authority, they moved as one, their eyes scanning the room with practiced precision. The leader, a tall woman with a sharp gaze and an air of no-nonsense determination, stepped forward. "Hank Mitchell," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "We've been looking for you." Hank's face went pale, and for the first time that night, he looked genuinely afraid. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice cracking slightly. The woman smiled, but it was a cold, calculated expression. "Let's just say we're here to clean up a mess. And judging by the looks of things, we're right on time." Terence glanced at Marcus, who gave him a subtle nod. Whoever these people were, they weren't random. Marcus had known they were coming, and he'd been counting on it. The bikers, now thoroughly rattled, backed away from the car, their earlier bravado completely gone. Hank, desperate to regain control, tried to rally his crew. "Don't let them scare you. We can take them." But no one moved. The bikers, once so confident in their numbers, now looked like cornered animals, their fear written across their faces. The woman stepped closer, her gaze never leaving Hank. "This is your last chance to do the smart thing," she said. "Walk away, and we won't have to make this worse for you." Hank hesitated, his pride warring with his fear. But before he could respond, Marcus spoke, his voice calm but commanding. "You've already lost, Hank. The only question is how much more you're willing to lose before you accept it." Hank's shoulders sagged, the weight of his defeat finally settling over him. He glanced at his crew, but they refused to meet his eyes. They were done fighting his battles. Terence watched silently, his heart pounding as the standoff reached its climax. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but one thing was clear: the night was far from over. The warehouse had gone eerily quiet, but the tension inside was at its breaking point. Hank stood rooted in place, his mind spinning as he tried to think of a way out of the situation. The woman's piercing gaze never left him, and a team stood behind her like shadows, their presence suffocating. His crew, once so loyal, now avoided his eyes, their fear unmistakable. He knew he was losing them, but his pride wouldn't let him admit defeat. Terence's heart was racing, though he kept his face calm. The confrontation had spiraled into something far larger than he'd imagined. He glanced at Marcus, whose expression remained steady and unreadable. Marcus seemed to be waiting, calculating, as though he could see the pieces of the game shifting around them. Whatever was about to happen, Terence could tell Marcus was prepared. Hank took a shaky breath and forced a smirk onto his face. "You think you've got me cornered," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I've dealt with tougher than you before. You don't scare me." The woman tilted her head slightly, her expression unimpressed. "This isn't about scaring you, Hank. It's about giving you one last chance to make the right choice before everything falls apart. You can't fight your way out of this. Not this time." Hank's hands curled into fists, his knuckles white. "You don't know who you're messing with." The woman raised an eyebrow, her calm demeanor unwavering. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with. A man who's run out of options. A man whose crew is about 2 seconds away from walking out on him, because they know this is a losing battle." Hank spun around to face his men, his voice sharp and desperate. "You're not seriously thinking about bailing on me, are you? After everything we've been through?" Pete shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Hank, we didn't sign up for this," he muttered. "This is bigger than a stolen car. We're in over our heads." The others nodded silently, their fear outweighing their loyalty. Hank's face twisted with anger and frustration. He turned back to the woman, his desperation clear. "What do you want from me?" he snapped. "What's it gonna take for you to back off?" The woman's expression softened slightly, but her tone remained firm. "It's not about what I want, Hank. It's about doing the right thing. Give the kid his car back, apologize, and walk away. No more games, no more stalling." Hank's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, a solution, anything to keep his crumbling world from collapsing completely. He looked at Terence, who stood quietly, his expression unreadable. This kid, this teenager, had flipped his entire operation on its head. Hank had underestimated him, and now he was paying the price. But Hank wasn't ready to admit defeat. Not yet. He took a step toward the car, his posture tense. "Fine," he said, his voice tight. "Take your car, but don't think this is over. You don't mess with me, and walk away clean." Before anyone could react, Hank reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device. Terence's stomach dropped as he realized what it was, a key fob, the kind used for remote ignition. Hank's thumb hovered over the button, his smirk returning as he regained a sliver of control. "You think you've won?" Hank sneered. "Think again. This car's mine now, and I'll make sure it's worthless to anyone else." Terence's breath caught in his throat, but Marcus stepped forward, his voice steady and sharp. "Hank, don't do it. You're only making things worse for yourself." Hank hesitated for the briefest moment, his confidence wavering under Marcus' intense gaze, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. With a defiant glare, he pressed the button. Nothing happened. Hank's smirk faltered as he pressed the button again, harder this time. Still nothing. Confusion turned to frustration, then panic as he realized the device wasn't working. He spun around, his eyes landing on Marcus, who stood calmly with his arms crossed. "Looking for this," Marcus said, holding up a small chip between his fingers. "Found it when we first walked in. You really should be more careful with your toys." Hank's face turned red with fury, but before he could respond, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance. The bikers froze, their eyes wide with fear. The woman turned her head slightly, a faint smile playing at the corner of her lips. "Looks like your time's up," she said, her voice low but firm. The sirens grew louder, the flashing red and blue lights visible through the warehouse windows. Hank's crew began to scatter, their loyalty to him evaporating under the weight of self-preservation. Pete was the first to bolt, followed by Roy and the others, their footsteps echoing as they disappeared into the night. Hank stood alone now, his fists clenched and his jaw tight. He looked at Terence, then at Marcus, and finally at the woman, who watched him with a mixture of pity and resolve. The game was over, and he knew it. But Hank wasn't one to go down quietly. With a roar of frustration, he lunged toward Terence, his movements wild and desperate. Terence braced himself, but before Hank could reach him, Marcus stepped in, his movements swift and precise. In a matter of seconds, Hank was on the ground, his hands pinned behind his back. "Nice try," Marcus said, his voice calm as he held Hank in place. "But you've done enough damage for one night." The sirens were deafening now, the warehouse bathed in red and blue light as the police arrived. Officers poured in, their weapons drawn, but they quickly assessed the situation and moved to take Hank into custody. Terence watched as the officers hauled Hank to his feet, his bravado completely gone. The bikers were nowhere to be seen, their loyalty as fleeting as the night itself. The tension in the room began to dissipate, but Terence knew the story wasn't over yet. This was just the beginning of the fallout. As the officers secured Hank, the tension in the warehouse seemed to lessen, but only for a moment. Terence let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, the weight of the night starting to sink in. He glanced at Marcus, who gave him a small nod of reassurance, his calm demeanor unshaken. The flashing red and blue lights danced across the walls, a surreal reminder of how far things had escalated. Just as Terence thought the ordeal might finally be over, a sharp voice cut through the noise. "Hold on a second." It was Pete, his face flushed and his breathing ragged. To everyone's surprise, he hadn't run far. He now stood just outside the warehouse, waving his arms at the officers. "You don't know the half of it," Pete shouted, his voice trembling but determined. "There's more, way more." The officers paused, their attention shifting to the disheveled man. Marcus' eyes narrowed, and Terence felt his stomach tighten. What could Pete possibly mean? Pete stepped cautiously back into the warehouse, his hands raised in a show of compliance. His gaze darted nervously to Hank, who was now handcuffed and glaring daggers at him. "Pete, shut your mouth," Hank bellowed, his voice filled with venom. "Don't you dare." But Pete shook his head, his resolve hardening. "No, Hank, I'm done covering for you. You want to act like you're the boss, but you've been putting us all in danger for too long." One of the officers stepped forward, his tone calm but firm. "What are you talking about? If you have something to say, now's the time." Pete swallowed hard, his eyes darting between Hank, the officers, and Terence. "It's not just the car," he said. "There's a storage unit nearby. Hank's been hiding stuff, stolen cars, parts, even other things." The room fell silent, the implications of Pete's words sinking in. Terence felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. This wasn't just about his car anymore. There was something much bigger at play. Hank struggled against his restraints, his fury boiling over. "You traitor," he spat. "You think they're gonna cut you a deal? You're nothing without me." Pete ignored him, his focus on the officers. "I can show you where it is," he said. "But you'll want to bring backup. Hank's got more people guarding it, and they're not gonna go down without a fight." The lead officer radioed for additional units, his expression grim. "We'll take it from here," he said, motioning for Pete to lead the way. As the officers began organizing their response, Terence felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Marcus, his expression serious. "This isn't over yet," Marcus said quietly. "If what Pete's saying is true, there's a lot more at stake here than just your car. We need to stay sharp." Terence nodded, his mind racing. He had thought the nightmare was coming to an end, but now it seemed like they were only scratching the surface. The thought of what might be in that storage unit filled him with a mix of dread and determination. He wasn't sure why Marcus had stuck by him through all this, but now he was grateful for the man's steady presence. As the officers prepared to move out, a sudden noise from outside the warehouse made everyone freeze. It was faint at first, like the hum of an engine, but it grew louder with each passing second. The sound was coming from multiple directions, and it didn't take long to realize it wasn't just one vehicle, it was a convoy. Terence's heart sank as headlights appeared in the distance, one by one, until a line of trucks and motorcycles surrounded the warehouse. The bikers had returned, and this time they'd brought reinforcements. Hank's smug grin returned, and he leaned toward the nearest officer, his voice dripping with mockery. "Guess you didn't think this through, did you?" He sneered. "You might have got me, but my boys aren't gonna let this slide." The officers quickly moved into defensive positions, their hands on their weapons. Marcus stepped in front of Terrence, his stance protective, his eyes scanning the scene with laser focus. The bikers dismounted from their vehicles, their faces hard and unyielding. Among them was a man who seemed to command attention without saying a word. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his presence radiated authority. "That's Red," Marcus said under his breath, his tone grim. "Hank's second in command. He's the one who handles the dirty work." Terrence felt his pulse quicken as Red stepped forward, his piercing gaze sweeping over the scene. He ignored the officers entirely, his focus locking onto Hank. "You really screwed up this time, didn't you?" he said, his voice low and gravelly. Hank's confidence faltered, but he quickly masked it with bravado. "Took you long enough," he said, trying to sound in control. "Get me out of these cuffs and let's deal with this mess." But Red didn't move. Instead, he turned his attention to Pete, who stood frozen in place, his fear palpable. "You can talking," Red said, his voice tinged with menace. "That's a problem." Pete backed away, his hands raised defensively. "I didn't have a choice," he stammered. "They were gonna find out anyway." Red's expression darkened, and he took a step toward Pete, but Marcus stepped in, his voice cutting through the tension. "That's enough," Marcus said firmly. "You've got bigger problems than Pete right now." Red stopped, his gaze shifting to Marcus. For a moment, the two men stared each other down, the air between them crackling with unspoken tension. Finally, Red smirked. "You must be the one who's been stirring up trouble," he said. "I heard about you." Marcus didn't flinch. "Then you know I'm not someone you want to mess with." The standoff was interrupted by the sound of more sirens in the distance. Backup was on the way, but Terrence couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to take a dangerous turn. The bikers weren't backing down, and the stakes had just been raised higher than anyone had anticipated.